He leadeth me. Oh, blessed thought. Oh, words with heavenly comfort brought. Whatever I do, where'er I be, still 'tis God's hand that leadeth me. He leadeth me, He leadeth me, for by His hand He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by His hand He leadeth me. Lord, I would clasp Thy hand in mine, nor ever murmur nor repine, content whatever lot I see, still 'tis my God that leadeth me. He leadeth me, He leadeth me, for by His hand He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by His hand He leadeth me. And when my task on earth is done, when by the grace the victory's won, even death's cold wave I will not flee, since God through Jordan leadeth me. He leadeth me, He leadeth me, for by His hands He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, for by His hands He leadeth me. Leadeth me, He leadeth me, for by His hands He leadeth me. His faithful follower I would be, by His hands leadeth me.
And when you're feeling down and out, and your burden's way down, you just look to God. He'll see you through, and He will make a way for you.
Well,
ever been a time in your life when things weren't going right? All the pain that you feel, it hurt so until you had no strength left to fight. Yeah, well, but let me tell you what to do. When your troubles get to you, just look to God, He'll see you through. Take your burdens and cares to the Lord and leave them there. He'll make a way for you. I know, my God, for you. Trust in Him, y'all. Each time He'll see you through. And when you're feeling down and your burdens weigh, all you gotta do is look to God. Oh, no matter what you're going through, and He'll make a way for you. Well, hey, through sickness and pain, the storm and the rain, Jesus, He'll be right there. Yeah. And when you can't find a friend who would even understand, talk to God. He can. Oh, Lord, you see, sometimes we go through things just to help us to see that the power is not me. Just hold on and pass the test. Let God handle the rest. He'll make a way, gonna make a way for me. I know my God will make a way for you. Just trust in Jesus. I know. Well, and when you're feeling down and out, all you gotta do is look to God. Hey, no matter what you're going through, I know. One more thing, y'all, listen up. Hey, well, there's no need to doubt, Lord, for God will bring you out to know of any trial you're in. Yeah, He will turn your life around. He'll wipe away that frown and just put your trust in Him. Oh, well, you see, He has a special touch when you finally had enough and you feel like giving up. Oh, just remember you're a child. Let's go on and wear a smile. He'll make a way for us. Now I know, my God, all you gotta do is trust in Jesus. I know, hey, and when you're feeling down and out, all you gotta do is look to God, my God. Oh, no matter what you're going through, yeah. He will make a way for you. Brothers and sisters, you're feeling down and out, your burden way down. All you gotta do is look to God. Lift your eyes to God, the only help I know. And He will make a way for you. When you're feeling down and out, all you gotta do is look to God. Hey, look to God, no matter what you're going through. Yeah. Take of the love and the bread, yeah. We do remember the blood Jesus shed, and this Jesus said to the 12, earnestly, oh, this you do in remembrance of me. Please do this in memory of what I did for thee. Please do this in memory of blood that Calvary. We don't shed blood, please, in memory of my Jesus. There were thorns on his head. Can't you feel the nails in my Savior's hands? Our Jesus hung on that old rugged cross for the sins of every man. He was abused, he was talked about, then they pierced my Savior inside. He shed his blood, and for you and me he died. Oh, do this in memory of what I did for thee. So why don't you do this in memory of bloodstained Calvary? So won't you eat of my flesh, drink of my shed blood. This in memory of my dear Jesus. Lord, every time I think about love, there is no doubt that you really loved, died for me. It was his grace, he took my place on Calvary. There is no greater love should have been amazing grace. I can't repay all that he has. Please do this in memory of what I did for thee. Why don't you do this in memory of bloodstained Calvary?
Good evening, and welcome to the Forest Hill Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible class. It's raining outside, but it's nice and warm in here. And I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And if you're visiting with us, we want you to know that you are our very special guest. And we invite you back every Wednesday at 7 p.m. On last week, we talked about the diary of a man after God's own heart. And we focused on 1 Samuel chapter 16. And tonight, we're going to recap a little bit about chapter 16, and then we're going to move into chapter 17. So if you have your Bibles, just go ahead and mark them, and while I kind of recap some of the things that we talked about last week. In chapter 16, we find Samuel, he was a little dismayed because of the fact that Saul was no longer the king of Israel. And God commanded him to go to Jesse's house, because in Jesse's house, he found a young man that was a man after his own heart, and he wanted to have him anointed as the new king. And Samuel was a little afraid because he knew that if Saul found out, he would kill him. And so, as the story goes, he went anyway because God had commanded him to do so. And when he got to Jesse's house, God could have told Samuel, look, I want you to go to Jesse's house, and I want you to anoint David. He's the youngest of his 8 sons, and he will be the next king of Israel. But there was a lesson for Samuel to learn. And so when Samuel got there, the first one he saw was Eliab. And he looked at Eliab, and he thought, surely this is the one that God wants me to anoint. But God took the time out to explain to him. He said to Samuel, do not look at the outer appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for man look at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And so we talked a little bit about the heart of a man. We talked about the fact that God was not moved by Eliab's stature or his appearance. God is not moved by the things that he had given Eliab. What he was looking for and what God looked for in all of us is not what he gave us, but what we give him back. Because what we give him back comes directly from our hearts. And so we talked about that, and I brought up the parable of the talents, and we talked about the servants that were given talents. One was given 5, one was given 2, and the other one was given 1 talent. And when the master returned, the one that had 5 talents, he returned 10 talents to the master. But the one that had 2 had 2 more talents, so he had 4 talents to give back to his master. But the one that had 1, he didn't value the talents that was given to him, and therefore he buried it. And when the master returned, all he did was went and dug it up, dusted it off, and tried to hand it back to the master. What happens if we don't value what God gives us? It's difficult to give him anything back of value. And so we talked about that, and then we talked about, and one I didn't talk about, what I wanted to bring up tonight was the parable of the Good Samaritan. In that parable, we find that there was a Levite, there was a priest, and there was a Samaritan. And what happened in that story was the priest and the Levite, they valued their title, not their service. And therefore, they couldn't give back anything to God. They couldn't service the man that was on the road because they valued their title. But the Samaritan valued what God had given him, and he was able to give back to God by serving the man on the road. And then we talked about good taste as opposed to taste good. When something have good taste, it's only on the surface. When it tastes good, that means that it's been marinated in the Word, and it's good through and through. And that's what God expects from us, and that's what he expects to see. And then we talked about my personal life. We talked about when my wife and I got married, and she moved in with me, and all she had to do was bring her clothes, and because the house was furnished and all of that, and all she had to do was just move in. And I remember coming home from work one day, and she had put a rug on the floor in the den, which kind of interfered with the acoustics. And so and I got up to go in and talk with her, but as I was walking out, I noticed that all the stuff in the house was things that I had purchased. And so I kind of went back and sat down. I kind of thought about it. The next day I went out and I had her name put on all my deeds, everything I owned. She was now a part of it. But also tucked away in my closet, I had a shoebox. And in that shoebox there were, because we had dated for about 11 years, and in that shoebox was every letter, every card that she had ever wrote to me. It was in the shoebox. And so I went and got the shoebox, and I set it down. I had the deeds, I had the shoebox, and we went through the deeds, and she signed all the deeds, and then I gave her this shoebox. And in that shoebox was every card that she had ever wrote, every letter that she had ever wrote to me for 11 years. But also in the shoebox was, when we were young, she designed a house. She said, this is the kind of house I wanted to live in. And that drawing was in the house, in the box. And we also had our children's names that we had talked about, that we decided we were going to name our children. There were going to be 6 of them. We fell short of that, but there were 6 names, and that was also in the shoebox. And the point was that what she gave to me had one value, but when I gave it back, it had more value than it did when I received it. And that's what God is looking for. He's looking for the value that we put on what he gives us. Young kids, I can't tell you enough how important it is to learn how to value the things that you receive from your parents. Learn how to value those things that your parents give you, because it's not, and you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be good looking. You just learn how to value those things, because when you learn how to value the things that you receive, the way you give them back will be totally different, and they will always be appreciated. What God was looking for was a man after his own heart. What he was looking for was a king that appreciated what he gave, what he was given to that man to be king. And he couldn't find that in Saul. And so David was the man. And so we find that as we move on, and we find that David valued everything that God had given to him. He valued everything that God and everything that he was giving him. And he also, as God said, was a man after God's own heart. I remember Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prayed, and at the end of his prayer he said, "But not my will, but thy will be done." See, it's so important that we value the things that God gives us, and that we realize and understand that it's not what we want, but what God wants for us. And when we understand that, he can make us kings, he can make us queens, he can mold us and shape us into whatever he wants us to be, rather than us shaping ourselves into what we think we should be. And then we talked a little bit about and then when David was anointed, and well, let's back up a little bit. When David, after all the young men had walked past Saul, and David, and God had still not given his approval, and he was waiting to find, and Samuel was waiting to find out who God was going to select, and all of a sudden they had ran out of young men, and so Samuel said, "Well, is there another one? What's going on?" And he said, "Oh yeah, there's one out in the field, but he's the youngest one, and I don't think that's the one." But Samuel said, "Well, look, I'm not going to sit down. This party's not going to start until you go and get him and bring him here." And as soon as he walked in, God gave Samuel the nod, and David was the one anointed. And as we move into chapter 17, some of the things that I found as I was looking at this is throughout chapter 16 and chapter 17, it was sort of like an on. And what I mean by on is it was as if a UN was put on everything. David was unknown. No one knew David. He was the best kept secret in Bethlehem. He was a no one that no one knew. He was unknown. The second thing I found when I was looking at that was that it was unimaginable that God would choose David. There's a story that is told about God after he had rejected Saul, and he had decided that David would be the king of Israel. And the angels came to God and they were asking him who would be the next king of Israel. And David said, why, of course, David of Bethlehem. And one of the angels said, David? Why, he's just a child. Another one said, he has no experience on the battlefield. And yet another said, he didn't have a royal background. And then one more and another asked, are you sure? He's just a shepherd boy from Bethlehem. Are you sure? And then they got together and they said, well, God, give us one reason why David qualified as the king of Israel, as the new king of Israel. Give us one reason why he qualified as the king of Israel. And God turned to them and he said, he gave me his heart. All of his heart belongs to me. When you give God your heart, he can make you a king. The other on was David was unnoticed. As a shepherd, the job was 24/7. You know, in Psalms 23, David talks about a shepherd, and he talks about how a shepherd is taking care of him and how a shepherd is there 24/7. And aren't you glad that we serve a God that is with us 24/7? I don't want to be praying and God say, hey, listen, 9 to 5, I'm off. Come back tomorrow at 9 o'clock and I will listen to you. But for right now, I'm off duty. God is a 9 to 5 God. And God is a 24/7 God. And David was a 24/7 shepherd. And then we find that David was also unforgettable. When Saul was being tormented by the evil spirits because the Spirit of God had left him, one of his servants remembered David, and he went to Saul and he said, behold, I have seen the son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is a skillful musician, a mighty man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speaking, and a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. If there's one thing, Saul, that you can count on, that can help you, is this young man. And so Saul sent for him. And so now we find as chapter 16 closes out and we move to chapter 17, we find that David has taken on a new job. He's now going back and forth to work with Saul during the times that he's being tormented, and he's also shepherding the sheep. One point I wanted to bring out as we move forward, that regardless to what was going on, David was expected to shepherd the sheep, and he continued to do his job no matter what happened. He continued to work and do the things that his father had commanded him to do, even though he was anointed as the next king of Israel. It didn't change. He didn't change at all. One of the other thing that we find is he was, that we're going to see as we move on into chapter 17 and we continue looking at some of the ons, is we're going to see that he was undeniable. He was unmovable. He was unafraid. He was undefeated. And so let's take a look into chapter 17 and see what's going on. Now, when we get to chapter 17, the writer of this of 1 Samuel is doing a lot of setting up. So I'm going to try to stroll through it as quickly as possible and kind of give you an idea. So I'm going to start at chapter 17, starting at verse number 4. And it says, a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That means he was over 9 feet tall. He was over 9 feet tall. And he had a bronze armor, and he had a bronze helmet on his head. And he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Now that's approximately 125 pounds. So this coat was pretty heavy. And then it says he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. His spear weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Now, 600 shekels is about 15 pounds. But every time Goliath would come out, his shield bearer would go before him. In other words, his shield bearer would go out, Goliath would walk out, and then he would begin to challenge the children of Israel. And this is what he would say. He said he would challenge the children of Israel, and he would ask them to choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. Now, when Saul and the Israelites heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And then I want to drop down to 16, because this is also dealing with the Philistine. And he says, and the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. That means that he had already probably came out about 78 or 79 times. And if anyone in the camp of the Israelites were going to deal with Goliath, they would have done it by now. And so now I'm going to go back, because I want to go back to verse 13, because 13 goes back to what was happening at David's house. Now, this was happening on the battlefield. Something was happening at David's house. And so I want to keep them separate so that we'll know what was going on, sort of like they say sometime, what was going on the ranch. And so back in David's house, the Bible says that, but David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So David was going back and forth. He had the 2 jobs, as we talked about before, and he was going to and from Bethlehem to make sure his father's sheep were fine, and then to make sure Saul was taken care of. And so Jesse said to David, take now for your brothers an ephah of dry grain and these 10 loaves, and run to these 10 loaves of grain, this ephah of grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brother's camp. And then he says, and carry these 10 cheese to the captain of their thousands, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. So Jesse was concerned about his sons. He had 3 sons that had followed Saul into battle. And so these were the things that he asked of David. Number 1, he said, check on your brothers, and then drop off these provisions, and then bring me back a report. God put on Jesse's heart to send some provisions to the Israelites. Jesse was wanting to know about his sons. He had 3 of them that had followed Saul: Eliab, Abinadab, and Shomon. And God had put on his heart to send David. Now, Jesse had 4 other sons at home that were much older than David. But David was the choice of Jesse. Jesse didn't know what was going on. David didn't know what was going on, but God had orchestrated this whole thing, and he was going to work everything out, and David was the man to go. And so David, and we're looking at verse 20 now. So David arose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. When he got there, the Israelite army, they were going out. They were getting ready to fight. And so they were going out to the field to meet the Philistines. And when he got there, as they were leaving out, David left the supplies in the hands of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came to greet his brothers. David dropped off the supplies. He saw his brothers in the crowd, and he spotted them, and he ran over to talk to his brothers to see how they were doing, so that he could go back and report to his dad that everything was fine. As he was talking in verse 23, the Bible says there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. Now, this must be about 80 times that he's been out there. And so David is hearing these words for the first time. So the men of Israel, and it says, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So when the men of Israel saw Goliath, instead of continuing to go towards the battle line, they turned and went the other way. And you can imagine David coming out there, and he's there to meet his brothers, and he's talking to his brothers, and he sees the men running out to do battle, and before the conversation get going good, all of a sudden, all the men that were in front of him were now behind him. And so David now said, David now said to the man standing near him, how will the man who killed this Philistine and free Israel from disgrace be rewarded? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should insult the army of the living God? Now, I thought this was interesting. And when I first looked at it, I didn't pick up on it. But then I started researching what David said and how it came across. And then I understood why his brother responded the way he did. David said, he called it a disgrace. Now, the question didn't bother the men that David asked. It didn't bother the men that was next to David, but it sure enough bothered his brother. Because it was bad enough for his brother to be seen running away from a battle. And then to hear from his baby brother that it was a disgrace. And so he was very upset because he heard the question. And so he responded in verse 28. He said, when Eliab, his older brother, heard him speaking with the man, he grew angry with David and said, why did you come down? Now, you got to understand, David had gone to the camp, and then he left the provisions with the provisions keeper, and then he went down to the battle line where the men were about to do battle. And so Eliab, ashamed and feeling a little disgraceful, he went to David. He said, why? Why did you come down? With whom have you left these sheep in the wilderness? I know you're arrogant. I know you're arrogant and dishonest, and you have a dishonest heart. You came down to enjoy the battle. Now, those are some strong words that Eliab shared or spoke to David. But he was angry. Oftentimes, the people closest to you can cause you to become angry, and that's because you're more vulnerable to the things that they do and say. And so, as we move forward and as we learn how to pursue God's heart, we're going to have to learn how to speak amongst each other so that we don't have this type of stuff going on. And so David said, now it's like the Hatfields and the McCoys, and they were going back and forth. And so David had enough sense to walk away. David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him towards another, and he said the same thing. And the people answered him as the first. Undeniable. David didn't allow people, his brother, to deny him from moving forward and doing the things that God had prepared him to do. And then in verse 31, the Bible says that now when the word which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came, he took a lamb out of the flock. I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by the beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears. And this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defiled the army of the living God. Oftentimes when we face situations like this, and here I have on the side, unafraid. Oftentimes when we face situations like that, we will get people that will tell us we can't do it. You can't go up against him. And it's bad enough because, we have to encourage ourselves. We have to get ourselves up for that. But David understood that he wasn't fighting his battles. Oftentimes, we remember what we're supposed to forget, and we forget what we're supposed to remember. You see, we forget all the victories that God has brought us through, and we remember all the failures that we experienced. I love that conversation with Saul and David because Saul remembered all his failures, and David was speaking from all the victories. When you just remember the failures, you'll never move. You'll never go out. You'll never challenge yourself. But if you remember the victories and who got you there, you'll expect him. You'll know that he's going to bring you through. And so when David finished talking with Saul, and they Saul decided, okay, I'm going to let you go. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put the bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with his coat of mail. And David fastened the sword to his armor, and he tried to walk. For he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Quick point. Just a quick point. The Philistines were considered a high-tech civilization of that day. They had iron. The Israelites were not allowed that technology because the Philistines feared that if the Israelites knew how to deal with iron, they would make swords and they would make spears and use them against them. So the only people in the Israel camp that had a helmet, an armor, and a sword in the entire camp was King Saul and his son Jonathan. None of the other Israelites had any of the armor. So not only was David outsized as far as dealing with the Goliath, but he was also, and didn't have the experience that Goliath had, he also didn't have the equipment that Goliath had, and the only one that had the equipment was Saul, and it didn't fit. And so the Bible says, then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began to draw near to David, and the man who bore his shield went before him. I was looking at this, and what bothered me about this passage was David had 3 brothers in the Israel camp, and David went out alone. He wasn't alone. He had God with him. But it seems like to me, if you have your baby brother going out to fight Goliath, you would at least go out and encourage him. But David went alone. David stopped at the brook, and from the brook, he picked up 5 smooth stones. If you understand terrain features and the valley, you know the brook is usually the lowest part of the valley. It probably divided the Israelites from the Philistines. And now David is at the brook. He's crossing over into the Philistines' court. He's pursuing Goliath. Interesting. And when the Philistine looked at David, he realized he was only a boy. Now, he had been asking them to send their champion. And they sent him a little boy. He was probably upset because he felt they didn't take him serious. And so he looked at David and he said, "Am I a dog? You come at me with a stick. You guys don't have anything to fight with? Is it that all that you have is a stick? Am I a dog that you're going to come and fight me with a stick?" He said, and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, You come at me with a sword, a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the army of Israel, whom you have defiled. David said, don't let my looks fool you, because I'm not the one you're going to be fighting. I'm not going to fight you. My God is going to fight you. Oftentimes we feel that we have to get out and we have to do all the fighting. But if we give God our heart and we trust in the Lord, He'll fight our battles for us. And He will always give us victory if we allow God to fight our battles. And then David said, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. And I kind of chuckled at that because I can imagine little David saying that the Lord is going to deliver you into my hands. And Goliath probably didn't believe that. And he said, into my hands, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air. Now David's talking about taking out more than Goliath. And the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God of Israel. So often we get out there and we try to prove a point and we have ourselves out front. But we need to know that it's not about us. It's always about God. And that's what David was saying, but Goliath didn't understand. And it says, so it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. Then David pulled his hand. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. And so that stone sank into the forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. When God fights your battles, when God have your heart, you don't need to fear. We have to learn how to allow God to be up front. This story it resonates in my mind because early on, God introduced Samuel to David. He didn't tell Samuel who he was going to anoint, but there was a lesson there for Samuel. When David went to the battlefield, God was introducing David to the children of Israel and to the Philistines. And through that introduction, God was letting the world know that it doesn't matter how tall you are, how short you are, whether you're fat, whether you're skinny, whether you're black, whether you're white, if God have your heart, you can conquer any battle that you're dealing with. But you got to give God your heart. There are so many giants out there that we fight every day. And it's a shame that God is just waiting for you to turn your heart over to Him and let Him deal with it. So often, we go in alone. It was bad enough David went to the battle alone. His brothers didn't join him. King Saul gave him his armor, but God was with David. What about you? Allow God into your heart. Give Him your heart, and He'll fight your battles. I want to thank you for tuning in tonight. I hope that something was said that will help you in your walk in life. And we just ask that you continue to join us every Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Thank you once again for joining us tonight.
Thank you for joining us this evening. And we'd like to say, please join us on Sunday at 10 a.m. for our regularly scheduled Sunday service. Have a good evening, and may God bless you and your family. Good night.